Today, we're diving into a pretty rare and powerful speech by Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. In it, he gives this deeply personal take on the Declaration of Independence, and he argues that its famous words, they aren't just some historical text. They're actually a living, breathing challenge for every single one of us.
So to really get inside Justice Thomas's perspective, we've got to start right here, with probably the most famous words in American history. For him, this isn't just a sentence. No, this is the absolute bedrock of his philosophy, and it's where his own story with the Declaration really begins.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break it down. We'll look at 4 key themes from his speech. First, how his childhood shaped his core beliefs. Second, why he believes devotion is this crucial missing ingredient. Third, a major philosophical clash he identifies. And finally, his really personal call for courage. Let's jump in.
All right, first up, Justice Thomas makes this argument that his understanding of equality, well, it wasn't forged in some university lecture hall. No, it came from the harsh, everyday realities of his childhood.
Think about it. He grew up in a world where the laws of man were in direct opposition to the nation's founding promise. The government that was closest to him, as he puts it, was the very one that was enforcing segregation and inequality.
But here's what he says is so fascinating. It wasn't the intellectuals or the politicians who taught him this stuff. It was the adults in his community. You know, his grandparents, the nuns at his school. These were people with very little formal education, but they held this unshakable faith in their inherent God-given rights.
For his community, equality wasn't some complicated theory you had to debate. It was a self-evident truth. It was an article of faith. They just knew they were equal in the eyes of God, and no law made by man could ever change that fundamental reality.
Okay, on to the second big idea in Thomas's speech. He argues that the principles in the Declaration, as beautiful as they are basically powerless without one critical human element. And that element is devotion.
He kind of suggests that we all focus so much on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that we completely miss what he thinks is the most important part. That pledge at the very end. That's what gives the document its teeth, turning it from just a philosophical essay into a truly revolutionary act.
I mean, just listen to that again. Our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Wow, this was not a casual promise. You have 56 men who were basically committing treason against the most powerful empire on earth. They were, for all intents and purposes, signing their own death warrants, all for an idea.
And that kind of devotion, well, it requires a very specific type of courage. Thomas actually brings up a definition from Franklin Roosevelt here. The signers, they weren't fearless. They were probably terrified. But they had decided that the principles of liberty and equality were just more important than their fear. More important even than their own lives.
And Thomas says you can see this spirit of devotion running all through American history. You see it in Patrick Henry's famous cry, in the incredible sacrifice of soldiers from Valley Forge to the beaches of Normandy, the heroism of the passengers on Flight 93, and then, in a deeply personal way, the quiet, lifelong sacrifice of his own grandparents.
So, this is where we get to the central conflict of his speech. Thomas argues that the Declaration's principles, well, they aren't universally accepted today. In fact, he says they're facing a direct challenge from a totally different philosophy, progressivism.
This slide really lays out the 2 different worldviews as Justice Thomas sees them. On one side, you have the Declaration's vision, rights that come from God, they're timeless, and they're protected by a limited government. And on the other side, what he calls the progressive vision, rights that come from the state, that can be changed over time, and that are managed by expert administrators.
And to back this up, Thomas goes right to the source, citing early progressive thinkers. He points to Woodrow Wilson, who he says openly rejected the founders' ideas and reportedly even called the whole concept of unalienable rights a lot of nonsense.
And for Thomas, this is not some abstract academic debate. He argues that when you replace the idea of universal, God-given rights with a belief in historical progress that's managed by experts, well, it can lead to some really terrible outcomes. He points directly to things like the resegregation of the federal workforce under Wilson and the rise of eugenics as historical examples of this.
This brings us to the final section of his speech, and really, his big conclusion. For Thomas, if these founding principles are truly under threat, then defending them requires that same courage and sacrifice that was shown by the signers all those years ago.
And he makes this incredibly personal. He takes us all the way back to 1983, to a time when he felt like he had lost everything. He was broke, living in what he described as a cockroach-infested apartment, and was just being relentlessly attacked in the media for his views.
In that moment of crisis, he says he stripped everything away and just asked himself one fundamental question. And it's a question he thinks every single one of us has to face eventually, when our convictions are really put to the test. What are your principles actually worth to you?
And here's his answer. He concluded that the principles he learned from his grandparents, the very same principles of the Declaration, were worth everything. This is his own personal connection back to that final sentence, his own pledge of life, fortune, and sacred honor.
So what does all this mean for us today? Well, Thomas says courage isn't just for soldiers on a battlefield. He outlines these everyday acts, speaking up with an unpopular truth, standing up for your faith, refusing to compromise on your principles, even if it costs you. These small acts, he argues, are the modern-day price of devotion.
And so we end right where we began, with that final, incredibly powerful sentence. Justice Thomas's speech is really a challenge, isn't it? He's asking us to see the Declaration not as some historical document that we admire from a distance, but as an active pledge, one that demands our own devotion, our own courage, and our own answer to that single vital question: what are your principles worth?